Ind.ieBeat How Studio Oleomingus is crafting its Indian postmodern fairy tale. For the last 3 years, Indian indie studio Oleomingus has been crafting its first game, a postmodern fairy tale called Somewhere. It's gifted the internet with occasional peeks into its magic realist world of stories within stories, notably with the interactive parable Timruk and the delightfully weird conversation generator Menagerie. This weekend, it plans on releasing a new short PC demo called A Museum of Dubious Splendors, which will be available on its itch.io page. Next year, it's also releasing a 2-hour side game called Under a Porcelain Sun. The game exists in a realm of luxurious patterns and striking colors. It juxtaposes odd everyday objects such as enormous tubes of toothpaste against lush trees with bizarre silhouettes. It's a surreal adventure through a fictional world built around a fictional playwright's writings, which seem to somehow intersect with modern reality. It's a game about stories in their various forms. Somewhere is a video game adaptation of an anthology by the Gujarati playwright Mir Umar Hussain, about the search for a mythical city called Kayamgad, said Oleomingus founder Dubious in an email to GamesBeat. Set in the southern Malwa region in 19th century British colonial India, it traces the lives of several people as they search for pages of a fabled journal which charts a route to Kayamgad. In Timruk, reading a book sometimes shifts the scene entirely to a new room or environment. In a museum of dubious splendors, you wander through corridors, gazing at items like cassette tapes displayed like works of art. Though it's not clear who we're playing in both of these short experiences, Yanni says that Somewhere will mainly follow the travels of Aziz and Azam, a duo of thieves who trade in forgeries. The pages they've duplicated come from the journals of Charles Henry Kennington, the explorer who first discovered the legendary Kayamgad. As the player joins them in tracking down the rest of the pages, they'll transform into various other characters and take on different identities, some of whom exist only in the imaginations or stories of other people. Our principal argument in creating Somewhere is to attempt an exploration of a particular form of fiction, one that we call concentric fiction, explains Yanni, where each node in the story spawns a repetition of authorship, and a series of nesting of narratives. Oleomingus's approach to games is hyperliterary. Yanni cites authors like Jorge Luis Borges, Fictional, The Olive, and Italo Calvino, Cosmic Comics, Invisible Cities, as influences on the recursive, meandering structure of the game. Other inspirations are graphic novelist Senarth Banerjee's The Hieropophiles and its fragmentary narrative style, and playwright Girish Karnad's fusion of mythology and the modern. The themes of Somewhere stories take their cue from colonial and post-colonial authors, such as Rudyard Kipling and D.M. Forster. A Museum of Dubious Splendors is what Yanni calls a rumination on the nature of an archive of recollections. It's an attempt to resurrect people from within the margins of stories that have never been recorded with any permanence, in that they are folklore-like, full of spurious histories that get told about each prosaic object on display, said Yanni in an email to GamesBeat. Oleomingus is a 2-person studio, Yanni and Sushant Chakraborty. Yanni writes, designs, and does the artwork, and Chakraborty handles the coding. They started collaborating while Yanni was part of an art residency program at Kaj, an artist's workshop and space in South Delhi. Here's an edited transcript of our interview. GamesBeat, can you tell me more about the two of you and how you came to form Oleomingus? Is this your first project? Dubious, our studio is based in Challa, a small town near Daman, on the western coast of India. I am an exhibition designer by training, though I have never practiced as such, preferring to work on a combination of speculative architecture and literature. Sushant is a programmer by training, and practices as one. I first met him on Unity forums, when I was working at Kaj about 3 years ago. Since then we have sought to concentrate our work on the confluence of post-colonial literature, speculative architecture, and games, combining avenues of investigation that interest us both. Somewhere, and the various stories that spawn from it, are indeed our first project. GamesBeat, how long have you been working on Somewhere, and how has the project evolved in that time?
Yanni,
We have been working on Somewhere for about 3 years, though our work on the project has been intermittent, starting and stopping to accommodate other practice and teaching assignments. But throughout this time, Somewhere has remained a continuous strand of inquiry and has recently become a predominant occupation of ours. Somewhere began as an exploration game at college. At college, we met the game theorist and author Savik Mukherjee, and worked with artist and author Priyas Abhinav, both of whose works informed our first tentative approach towards the creation of our game. Priyas's writings, especially his curation of the Museum of Vestigial Desire, continue to remain a source of lasting inspiration. When we started working on Somewhere, the procedure of building games was alien to us, and we blundered the best we could while spending a large amount of our effort delineating the narratives that would occupy our game. The fictional world of Biladish, the kingdom of Khotanku, and the search for Kayamgad were all created while we grappled with learning how to build spaces and make them interactive. And as we delved into colonial history, we started to mask our writings for the game by creating the persona of Mir Omar Hussain, a fictional Gujarati poet whose works we are ostensibly adapting in game form. This was done in part because it was easier to negotiate our literary influences in a traditional form of writing rather than use interactive fiction from the start. It allowed us to broaden Somewhere from a game to a transmedia project, rooted in post-colonial textual practices. And it spread the implications of our narrative across a span of nearly 100 years, letting us demonstrate recognizable effects of events in the 1800s on the record of history as understood after independence. Eventually, as our craft grew and as resources permitted, we started building one story at a time from this narrative space. All the while adding to the fiction, embroiling it into history, and inveigling our own characters into the stories of many who lived and wrote prolific records at the time. With aid from the India Foundation for the Arts, IFE, Kaj amongst others, we started building our game and codifying our collection of stories by Mir Omar Hussain. Some of this work is made available online, and some is meant to be consumed locally at exhibitions and at institutions. But over the past year, a confluence of support and a certain confidence in our skill have allowed us venture something a little more ambitious. With IFE, we started working in earnest on the theoretical implications of our work, on whether games could meaningfully contribute to the pantheon of post-colonial discourse. And we also started working on a 2-hour-long Steam build for the game, using our most ambitious story set in verse as the template. This Steam build is called Under a Porcelain Sun and we will be releasing it next year. *Ind.ieBeat, can you talk a little about your inspiration for Somewhere? Do you draw from a lot of literary sources? Yanni, our work is deeply influenced by post-colonial writing and postmodern literature and early magical realist literature. Our literary references are broken into 3 distinct categories that pertain to their specific domain of influence. Structural, Jorge Luis Borges, Fictionis, The Olive, Italo Calvino, Cosmicomics, Invisible Cities, Orhan Pamuk, The White Castle, My Name is Red, Sarnath Banerjee, The Harappa Files, Barnaul Capers, Sukhumar Ray, Abeltable, and Girish Karnad, Tughlaq, Hayavadna. Narrative, especially writings of colonial and post-colonial authors, Sadat Mando, Agha Shahid Ali, E.M. Forster, J.G. Farrell, Amitav Ghosh, John Lang, Fanny Parks, Rudyard Kipling, and others. Theoretical and historical, Aini Alumba, J.M. Coetzee, Edward Said, John Key, Ramila Thapar, Arthur L. Basham, and Manuel de Landa. For example, the build we are crafting now, a museum, is a rumination on the nature of an archive of recollections. An attempt to resurrect people from within the margins of stories that have never been recorded with any permanence. In that they are folklore-like, full of spurious histories that get told about each prosaic object on display. Here we borrow a structure from Rudyard Kipling's Just So stories, and superimpose that atop something like Calvino's recurring motifs of dialogue from Invisible Cities. *Ind.ieBeat, can you tell me more about the game's story? Are some of the events and characters based on cultural or historical fact or is it mainly fiction? Yanni, Somewhere is a video game adaptation of an anthology by the Gujarati playwright Mir Umar Hussain, about the search for a mythical city called Kayamgat. Set in the southern Malwa region in 19th-century British colonial India, it traces the lives of several people as they search for pages of a fabled journal which charts a route to Kayamgat. The discovery of Kayamgat is attributed to Charles Henry Kennington, who, having become separated from his caravan after the Matsyapur siege, stumbles into this fabled city in the year 1812. Upon his return, an account of his travels to Kayamgat are published, accompanied by intricate sophistry and peculiar theocentric writing. Kennington's blasphemous writings and a passionate avowal of the book by a group of influential